If you ever stepped foot into a blockbuster in the early 2000s, there's a high likelihood you saw one of these two games sitting on the shelf. And whether it was The Two Towers or Return of the King, I hope you made the right decision and rented one of these legendary titles. It kinda goes without saying that these are two of the greatest officially licensed games of all time, offering great gameplay, bonus content, and a heck of a lot more. I know I'm not alone when I say that these games were worthy of sinking tons of hours into, especially the latter, which if you had a friend, had the option for couch co-op. Despite how great these two games are, and how much fun I had returning to them recently, we're not here to talk about them today. Instead, we're diving into something that somehow I only just recently discovered. This is the Game Boy Advanced version of The Lord of the Rings: Return of the King. Published in 2003 by EA Games, let me tell you something, this is a hidden gem, especially if you're a fan of isometric hack and slashers. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, this is a Lord of the Rings Diablo game, and a pretty damn good one at that. Your adventure begins with choosing between one of 6 playable characters: Aragorn, Gandalf, Éowyn, Gimli, Frodo, or Legolas. From there, you jump right into your journey, which I spent the majority of my playtime on my Aragorn playthrough, and was genuinely surprised when I saw that some of the different characters actually have completely different starting locations and objectives than the others. And I mean, it makes sense when you consider the actual plot of the movie, but I don't know, I guess I just wasn't expecting that much from a Game Boy Advanced game. Silly me, I guess. There are other small differences that happen too, like how towards the beginning of the game, when the time comes to confront Saruman at Isengard, if you're playing as Gandalf, you actually have to fight him as a boss, but if you aren't playing as Gandalf, you just sort of watch him plummet to his death. So, no matter who you choose to play as, you get a pretty unique experience. Whether you're forcing the King of the Dead and his legion to fulfill their oaths as Aragorn, making the journey to Mount Doom as Frodo, with the help of Sam of course, or slashing across the battlefield to light the beacons of Gondor as Gandalf, the different characters offer experiences that are varied enough to warrant playing through the game multiple times. But you probably won't want to play through multiple times if you don't enjoy the gameplay. So, what's it like? Well, if you've played through a Diablo-like game before, you'll have a pretty good idea. I'll give sort of a high-level overview before breaking some items down into more detail. You move across various maps, taking on enemies with either melee, ranged, or magical attacks. You have a health bar, a spirit or mana bar, and a nice convenient compass that keeps you going in the right direction. As you kill enemies, you gain experience, kill enough of them, and you level up. Upon leveling up, you gain attribute points that can be assigned to various stats like strength, accuracy, or health, and you also earn skill points that can be used to unlock various abilities that are specific to each character. Enemies drop various pieces of gear that you can use to increase your effectiveness by slotting them into various gear slots. You have access to slots for your chest piece, helm, gloves, boots, coat, charms, and 2 weapon slots. That gear and other helpful items can also be found hidden in barrels, tree stumps, and treasure chests. There aren't traditional vendors in the game per se, but there are things that you'll encounter that take on that role. Specifically the Forge, Rune Forge, Shrine, and Ranger Hollow, which serve as ways to sell gear, store it for other characters, buy healing items, upgrades, and more. Now, when you first start off, things seem fairly simple. You can pretty easily dispatch enemies, and as long as healing items continue to drop, you won't really have that much difficulty. You'll level up, unlock new skills, maybe find a shiny new weapon, but let me tell you, at some point the game will go from being all sunshine and rainbows to extremely difficult. The sound of my attacks missing over and over again will forever be ingrained in my brain. Just standing there, getting miss after miss after miss, while my health bar gets slowly chunked down, it's a feeling of helplessness that's hard to describe. Seriously, if you do decide to try this game, please for the love of God put tons of attribute points into accuracy, you'll thank me later. Speaking of attribute points, let's break down what each one does. Strength affects damage range and slightly increases your HP. Accuracy increases your percentage likelihood of scoring hits, which, as I just mentioned, is absolutely crucial. Health, as expected, increases your primary HP pool. However, it also adds a little bit of spirit. Each attribute point spent here grants 4 HP and 1 SP or spirit point. Defense lowers the ability for your enemies to successfully damage you. And courage acts sort of like the opposite of the health attribute. granting 4 SP and 1 HP per point spent. Defense and accuracy are by far the most crucial attributes to focus on increasing, because not being able to hit enemies just feels bad, and the opposite goes for enemies not being able to hit you. That feels great. So yeah, focus on these two if you give the game a try. If you don't, you may hit a wall where things just seem impossible. I know there were a couple of times when I definitely did. Now, when it came to the different character skill trees, I found myself primarily focusing on the passive abilities that did things like grant increased toughness, damage, or dodge chance. I really don't know if this is the best way to go or not, but since melee attacks by default have AoE included in them, I didn't really see the need to try to go for much else. There are a good amount of skills to experiment with, but by the time I reached a high enough level to get into some of those higher tier skills, my focus was solely on surviving via dishing out and taking the least amount of damage possible. I have to say here though that there was one active skill that felt great to use, and was about as thematically on point as you could possibly get for a Lord of the Rings game. That, of course, is Frodo's ability to use the One Ring. When used, Frodo becomes invisible for a set period of time, becoming undetectable to enemies. I found this to be incredibly useful for sneaking past difficult parts of certain levels. The ring, of course, has a pretty big drawback in this game, but to fully explain it, we'll need to explain the mechanic it interacts with, because it's actually something present no matter who you're playing as: the Eye of Sauron. As you're playing, you'll periodically encounter enemies, like these guys who run around banging drums, that call the eye's attention. The eye will get more and more intense as its focus on you grows. When the meter is maxed out and the eye's attention is fully on you, ring rates will spawn, which are not to be trifled with. Using the ring as Frodo instantly increases the eye's attention on you by a substantial amount, balancing it in a way that prevents it from being used excessively, but still allowing it to be quite powerful. This was by far the most unique skill in the game for me, and the one that stood out the most, in the same way that, out of all the characters, Legolas stood out to me the most for his ability to use bows and standard ranged attacks. All of these different elements of gameplay come together in a way that creates a unique isometric experience that any fan of Lord of the Rings, or maybe even the genre, will enjoy. Before we conclude, I just want to touch briefly on visuals and audio. Obviously, this doesn't hold a candle to the PS2 or Xbox version of the game, but for being a Game Boy Advanced game, I really can't complain. I actually think the graphics lend themselves well to the style of gameplay we get here, and when combined with the game's soundtrack, it creates a really immersive Lord of the Rings experience that holds up pretty damn well. And performance-wise, it runs good. I did notice a couple slowdowns in some areas that had a significantly larger amount of enemies on screen than normal, but this only happened a handful of times and is nothing worth being concerned about. Also, if you happen to have a buddy that has a Game Boy Advance too, the game supports co-op via a link cable, which is a really nice touch. So, would I recommend this game? I would say it's 100% worth it. If you've got a long flight or maybe a road trip in the passenger seat ahead of you, you could kill a ton of time with this, and I'm sure you would have no problem emulating it on almost any handheld device. While this by no means replaces the classic Lord of the Rings titles I fell in love with on my PlayStation 2, it would make a fine addition to anyone's retro gaming collection. Thanks for watching, until next time.